This is Talking Technology, a podcast produced for RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. I'm Gary Barker.
And I'm Leon Gettler.
And this is episode 2 for our series in 2014. And today's date is Friday, the 31st of January. And Leon, we have a chat this week with Professor Bob Wood of the Florey Institute, one of the world's leading neuroscience research centres, and he's got a very interesting project running with the ABC on developing intellectual strength in the human race.
That's right. They're talking about monitoring brain activity and intelligence and cognition by using gaming technology.
That's right, computer games, quite simple ones. Well, they look simple, they're two-dimensional, no, they're not Warcraft 6 or anything like that, but they've got an algorithm that assesses brain improvement by the exercises these games produce. Games technician Claude Thomas up at the ABC has been designing them.
Well, yes, Professor Bob Wood, who's Professor of Psychology at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health, is really interesting. So let's listen to him.
Bob Wood, we're talking about active memory brain training, which I think is one of your specialities. You're at the Florey Institute, and you've been dealing with this and with gaming to enhance brain development and intelligence. Tell us about how that works.
Okay, Clive. So there's a couple of issues tied up in the opening comments that you made. First of all, the whole idea of the malleability or trainability of intelligence, and by intelligence here we're referring to basic cognitive functions such as attention, flexibility, and working memory, and also to a lesser degree the more crystallized intelligence component, which is knowledge. And so this has long been a question: can we improve these functions in people, or can we slow the decline, whether it's disease-related or just age-related decline in these functions? So that's the first question, and that's a research question that's received a lot of attention over almost 100 years with mixed results. I think in recent times, with changing technology and improved techniques, there seems to be much more hope for gains, and there's some research evidence that's emerged. We're joining that research program with our own particular approach, which is active memory, and we'll be running controlled studies looking at the impacts of the training processes on different populations. Now, the second issue, the point of gaming that you mentioned, one of the things we do know about this so-called brain training, and I'll come to the definitional components of that shortly, is that it's not a short process. It's not like you can go in and have a 30 or 40 minute training program and suddenly you're improved. It takes lots of repetition over extended periods. And of course that brings in problems of frustration, fatigue and boredom. And also it does require commitment and engagement on the task, requires some sense of motivation or commitment to continue playing and engagement with it. And that's where the gaming comes in. So what we're trying to do is to convert cognitive training tasks into fun, engaging tasks and so we've in the ABC, who we've been collaborating with, that's the Australian Broadcasting Commission, has hired gamers to develop the active memory training regimes, and so they're fun and engaging. And the purpose of that is to hope that people stay playing for long enough that we can see whether a difference emerges.
And games would focus attention more, wouldn't they? I mean, I talk to psychologists occasionally, and they point out that, say, somebody who's being treated for fear of flying is given an exercise maybe on an iPhone or an iPad that absorbs their attention so that the anxiety goes away. So that gaming in what you're doing would focus attention quite a lot.
Right, that's right. Well, people often stop doing tasks for a couple of reasons. One you mentioned, right, there's a sense of anxiety or fear. Another is a sort of frustration or a sense of a lack of progress. So in addition to the gaming, which makes it interesting and makes you want to keep playing, we've developed a algorithm that underpins the allocation of tasks that ensures what we refer to as progressive mastery. Now, when you think about it, most cognitive testing, which is that cognitive tests are the tasks that we use to train people. Those cognitive tests are aimed at selecting people out, categorizing people on levels. What we want is to keep people playing. So training serves the exact opposite function. It's not about selecting people out. It's about keeping people in. And so in order to do that, we need to regulate the level of task difficulty so it's matched to the person's current capability levels. And so that means rather than having highly standardized allocation of tasks, we have an algorithm that would adjust for individuals and allocates tasks. And if a person's not making sufficient progress, then the algorithm will drop them down to some simpler, more achievable tasks and then bring them back up gradually over time.
Intelligence levels vary a lot across the human race. How far, with this sort of training, you could develop somebody who had a lower capacity than, say, genetically? What causes that?
Well, that's the argument, and certainly, or the hypothesis, and it is a hypothesis. I mean, I think there is evidence to show that specific cognitive functions, such as attention or working memory, are improved by training. I would characterize the research as, at this point, a series of spot fires. Yeah, there's evidence around the place, but there's not one raging inferno. And there are actually a lot of meta-analyses out there at looking at meta-analyses is when they pull together all the different individual studies and look at the overall result. And there is some support for improvement in working memory and a few other areas with selected populations. So at this point, we're looking to say, can we sharpen those skills? Now, could I just take another point that was in your question, which is the point about intelligence and genetically determined. And we are not getting into the debate how much is nature and nurture here. We're simply saying through the systematic training, which would fit into the nurture paradigm, can we improve? And there's a couple of big questions tied up in that, right? The first one is, can we improve the specific cognitive functions that make up intelligence? And those cognitive functions are things like attention, both focus and ability to switch attention, flexibility, working memory, and the more crystallized intelligence, the knowledge component. So the question is, can we demonstrate improvements in those cognitive functions? That's the first question. But then the next question is, can those improvements, can we get evidence that they're manifest in everyday tasks that use those functions? Now, that's what we call far transfer. So does it make you better if you're an older citizen? Does it reduce the risk, improving your attention switching and focusing, does it reduce the risk of falls? Does it improve your functioning on everyday tasks that require cognitive reasoning and the like? And so the evidence for transfer is much weaker than the evidence for demonstrating improvement on the tasks themselves, right? And so the first question is, can we improve the cognitive functions and demonstrate it on similar but different types of tasks, similar types but different tasks? And that. The next question is, can we look at, and does it make a difference to people's everyday health outcomes, their performance on tasks that require these cognitive functions? So that's going down to the application. Going back from the cognitive functions, the question is also, are there changes in the brain structure and the brain processing, which would lead us to believe it's a much more sustained and more permanent change if that's the case. And there's some research, but not a lot of research in that area. So most of the research has focused on improving the cognitive functions. It hasn't looked at this point, there is some, but not a lot, looking at, does it change the underlying brain structures and brain processes? And then that's going back upstream sort of to the basics, and then going downstream to the applications. Is there evidence that it improves in everyday life? Now, one area that there is clear evidence of improvement in everyday life is in self-confidence. People who do well on these tasks feel a sense of mastery, they feel more confident, and it may be that even if the specific functions don't improve, that sense of confidence reduces the anxiety you spoke of in your example of the pilots. And if you reduce the anxiety, you make greater use of the cognitive assets that you have, or cognitive resources. So it may be, even if it didn't change the underlying functions that it's trying to do, it changes this ancillary function, which is motivation. It's almost like a placebo, but that leads to benefits and people lead happier, healthier, more confident lives.
So the brain, of course, is plastic, and I'm one of those who believes that if you keep a brain active, your whole system, the whole human frame system, will be in better shape for longer, and we've got an aging population. So would this be part of the research you're doing?
Absolutely. So I am not a neuroscientist. I'm a cognitive social cognitive psychologist. Sorry, I got wrapped up in those words there. But colleagues, I have colleagues, Tony Hammond, Colin Masters, and Jing Q at the Florey, who work on the neural side. So the plan is we will have people who are participants in studies. We'll do large-scale studies which will look at the impacts of on cognitive functions, which we can test using simulations, and then we'll look at everyday transfer. But then selective subpopulations will be brought in for different types of testing, MRI testing and other sort of brain scan activities.
So that we will get some sort of really solid information in the end about how you deal with an aging population, keep it working, I guess.
Yeah. So does it impact? And of course, through the Florey is a leading neuroscience and mental health institute. And as you rightly said, the brain, it's the engine that drives our bodies, and it drives a sense of who we are, our mental health, and all sorts of things. And so at the Florey, there are people like Professor Colin Masters, who study Alzheimer's. There are people who study impacts of the brain on depression. So what we'll be doing is looking at, first of all, do these brain training programs, as I said, have an impact on the cognitive functions themselves? Do they have an impact on everyday functions? And then with selected populations, do they have an impact on the brain development and the brain activity? And that may be for a normal healthy population of different ages, youth, or it could be for an identified disease population such as Alzheimer's, or it could be people at risk for mental health, depression, or other forms of illness.
So say take something like Parkinsonism or Alzheimer's for that matter. Training of this order might produce a longer, or say better action. It
may slow down decline.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are... you made the point that the brain is plastic, but I think it's very easy to overstate the degree of plasticity. Okay, we're not talking about, as I said earlier, it's a lot of training, a lot of commitment. It has to be enjoyable. It has to be engaging, and of course, this sort of training is only one of the determinants of the function of the brain. I'll mention a few others in a few moments, but it may be that for a population that has a certain disease, which is genetically determined, or it could be environmentally determined, this sort of training slows it down or reduces the impacts of treatment. So there is some evidence, limited at this point, but some evidence that people who are being treated for cancer often suffer what is called a chemo fog. The chemotherapy treatment leaves them sort of drowsy and not clear. There is some evidence that this sort of training helps clarify. It builds a focus, and it's almost like it pulls them out of the chemo fog. Now, as I said, that's very limited evidence. It's not something you can run around and make recommendations. But so there's a wide variety of potential applications, because a lot of mental illnesses, of course, are manifest in poor cognitive function of the talk we're talking, lack of flexibility, inability to hold attention. So if something that sharpens that skill in the short term may provide some short-term relief, even without the sort of long-term changes.
You were talking about brain training, and you were going to go a little more deeply into that, of how it's done, why and where, what might...
Okay, so... and as I said, brain training we chose to call our product Active Memory because it's about the active cognitive functions that produce memory and influence your recall and the like. So, as I said, we're much more confident about producing those changes. quite deliberately didn't call it a brain thing because that's much more hypothetical at this stage. Does it make any differences to the brain? But the popular term brain training, it does typically apply to training that's targeted at cognitive functions. The three big cognitive functions that are often associated with fluid intelligence, that's the dynamic components of intelligence, as distinct from the crystallized knowledge components, are typically flexibility, they are attention, and that's both focusing and switching attention, your ability to move, and thirdly, working memory. And then there's some other sort of meta functions, executive functions alike, but those are three ones. And the way brain training has developed is it looks at what are the testing that are used to establish those, what are the marker tests that are used to establish those underlying contributors to this generalized G component of intelligence. And then they take those tasks and variations of them and convert them into training tasks. And then you put a gaming overlay which makes them funny. You might, instead of using just abstract figures, you might use dynamic card decks, or you bring it into a sort of simulation of moving cars or driving a car or something like this. And there's, I said, there's a lot of that going on all around the world. A lot of these general interventions. It's been, I think, the development of this term gamification has become very, very popular. And one of the things I've learned dealing with people like Claude Thomas and the other people at the ABC is I've studied motivation and researched it and taught it for probably 25 years, and I learn a lot from these people. What they know intuitively about how to make tasks interesting is quite compelling to see. And as I said, then there's a whole idea of progressive mastery. How do you keep people engaged? And I think digital platforms have just given us such incredible flexibility to do that. Whereas when you think about it, we can have an audience of currently 20,000 people playing active memory, and each of them is in a classroom of one. And because we don't have to, while we have a big package of material, we can deliver it in dynamic ways, and the algorithm that underpins active memory learns about the individual, it learns about the tasks and the difficulty, and it's constantly adapting. Compare that to running an active memory or a brain training program in a classroom where you have 20 people sitting in front of you and you have to bring them all through at relatively standardized times just because of the control requirements of the classroom. So we're hoping this algorithm, where for areas where you've got to define content like mathematics or whatever, using the digital platforms, you'll be able to deliver it. And this is the knowledge component as distinct from the flexibility, attention, and working memory. The knowledge, if you've got a specific body of knowledge, and it could be cricket scores, it could be knowledge of baseball, it could basketball, or it could be history, or it could be mathematics. You can you can have if you categorize the tasks and you learn the relative difficulty, the algorithm can allocate them in individuals so they move through at a rate that helps them maintain progressive mastery, and they gradually improve. Yeah. So and I think that's all been made possible by the creation of the sorts of digital platforms that we have available now.
Where in fact you could be among millions and still be one-to-one.
Totally, yeah. So now it doesn't have the personal component, right? You still need to be able to ask questions, but we may reach a point through voice recognition and banks of questions. I mean, any professor or university lecturer or teacher knows that over time you develop a form of expertise, which is a bank of answers to the types of questions generated, and there always are unique questions, but let's say 90% or 95% of them are learned over time. So you could almost have a situation, and this is starting to sound very a cyber world, but where you play the tasks, and then you have questions, and through voice recognition, you ask the question, and it then gets refined through an interactive program, and then it goes into the bank and pulls out the answer.
Well, there is the current movie called Her, where somebody speaks to his telephone and the telephone responds with a flexible human response. Yeah,
that's right. I hope we can get Scarlett Johansson answering. Then I'm sure we'll have a big sign up. I understand she is the actress who. Yes. I was reading a review of that, which is quite interesting, right? It is a signal of where technology is taking us, and I think it it offers that challenge. Well, I think what it's doing is moving us into greater flexibility, and which is very important. We still need that human overlay. I think it's, because we are human, and the social condition is very important to our well-being. But it's going to give us flexibility in the delivery of content, both in the form, as you've said, in the form of, or we've said, in the form of questions as well as specific tasks. And that. Could I just make a comment on that, given we're talking about the cyber world, and make a transition? As I said, brain training is one of the determinants of brain health, potentially. That's a hypothesis we're pursuing. What is much more certain is diet, exercise, and social interaction are very, very critical. Not drinking too much, not smoking, doing regular exercise and the like. And so these are all critical determinants of so many of the things that we think about. So I don't want people to imagine a world in which you can just sit in front of a computer playing games and asking a voice recognition program questions and think you're going to end up really healthy. It'll be in a very limited sense. One of the impacts of aging, which has a sort of underlying brain impact, is people start to challenge their memory. They move from and this is a motivational thing, they move from a learning mindset. So you and I are talking, we're asking one another questions, we're confident, and then you ask me a question, I can't remember the answer. As you get older, you start to see situations like that as a test, and you hear people start saying things like, oh gosh, I've got a poor memory. And then they start to believe that, and they start withdrawing from social interaction. And so you don't, and in effect, social interaction is a form of training. It's forcing you to pull out things. As you get older, you do tend to forget more things because there's more things to remember. You're in different situations, the expectations are different. What we do know is that if you maintain a learning mindset, you're quite relaxed, saying, oh damn, I forgot it. What was it again? It'll come back to me, and maintain that positive mindset, then you will continue to function. But there are some cases where people start to feel like it's a test, they withdraw, then they don't go through the sort of normal training that life provides us with interactions, and so the skill starts to atrophy, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So social interaction, one of the bylines of this little example is social interaction is important to continued development of the brain and sense of well-being.
Like the coffee shops in Silicon Valley, where the developers and all the rest of the engineers gather and toss ideas around.
Exactly.
And out of that, you get iPads and iPhones.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people think about learning as something that happens in a formal education, with where there is goals and materials. But of course, informal learning is probably the dominant form. And people differ quite remarkably in their capability. One, to recognize learning opportunities. So to see the coffee shop in Silicon Valley as, this is not a formal situation, it's just a strategic, opportunistic approach. But also people vary quite remarkably in the value they extract from everyday experience. And our research, before we moved into the active memory, my colleague Damien Burney and I, who have collaborated in the development of active memory along with working with the ABC, we studied the development of flexible expertise, which is the adaptive use of knowledge over time. So taking existing knowledge and expertise, how do people apply it adaptively? And what we learned is there were many factors. One, they tend to take a learning mindset. They tended to see the use of knowledge as less as a test, less as a test of their ability, more as an opportunity to test the knowledge itself, which is a subtle but very, very important difference, right? Because if it doesn't work, on the one hand, you interpret as I lack ability. On the other is, this knowledge is not working well. I need a new strategy. And and now we've moved from the knowledge component, the crystallized intelligence, into the fluid intelligence.
Finally, Bob, we're getting into a highly technical world, and I think a lot of people think that if Australia is going to replace its manufacturing industries with things that will go on, we're going to need people who are and this is a lay view of it, brighter, sharper and better educated and things like that. But what you're doing would assist that, because if we don't improve the brain activity, if you like, of the broad population, people are just going to drop off, aren't they?
Right. Yes, I agree. And I think, through a series of sort of revolutions, I think people talk about the knowledge industry. We may even be post-knowledge into sort of some sort of digital collective memory. Certainly making people aware of their place in that world and feeling more confident about it. I mean, I think any process that sharpens people's fluid functions, their cognitive flexibility and their attention, it enables them to extract more value from experience. So going back, let's assume all this brain training had no impact on underlying cognitive functions or necessary on the brain. And that's, as I said, these are things we need to study. But if it improved people's confidence so that they were more engaged, they learnt more from their day, I mean, that makes for a better life, it makes for a better team, and it can make for a better society, because our cognitive functions are one of the major assets, both in human capital, but also in social capital. How people interact together. And so, even if in a very small way, active memory training contributes to that, then our main concern in the short term is the betterment of individuals and their lives. But if it leads to greater productivity in different settings, then I think that would be a good thing too.
So if you've got healthy brains in the community, you've probably got a healthy community.
Oh, absolutely, right. And the massive costs that are coming through unhealthy brains in mental health, Alzheimer's, a wide range of fractures and falls. People who start to doubt their confidence in attention and withdraw. If their attention functions start to atrophy, they're more prone to fractures and falls. That adds costs. So a lot of health costs in society are the products of malfunctioning or not fully fit brains.
Professor Bob Wood, many, many thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, maybe I ought to start playing some of these games, Leon. Might help the old grey cells.
That's right.
But fascinating bit of science, and interesting that the Florey Institute is teamed up with the ABC, and the ABC, you can log in there. You go to abc.net.au and look for active memory, and you can register and play the games and see what it does for your brain.
Absolutely. And that's it. And in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be talking to Sean Duker, who's the Chief Technology Officer at McAfee.
And that's all about the technology that they use to try and protect even consumers against the rising tide of cybercrime that's hitting the planet.
That's right. And in the meantime, you can keep in touch with us on Talking Tech TC on Twitter or on Facebook. Until then, stay safe, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.